जैसे बात करें
कैसे लगता है
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Am I audible? Abhilash?
Yes, ma'am, you are.
Okay, fine. Good afternoon, everyone. We are just waiting for a few more members to join. And I suppose Professor Benton has also come in. So in another 5 minutes, we should be ready to go. निकाला उसने स्लाइड निकाला
हाँ मैम निकाल दो
Okay. Unmute किया।
Good afternoon. I hope I'm audible here. Professor Benton has just joined us, and we are about to start with the session for today. I can already see a few more of my colleagues and friends joining in, and a lot of them have opted to be on YouTube, which starts streaming at 3 p.m. sharp. So we have a lot of people who will be joining us on YouTube. Because we are handling a large crowd, we are going to be muting most of the participants. We request all the participants to please put in your queries, your comments in the chat box, so that we can note them down and present them to Professor Benton at the end. Similarly, we also have some volunteers who are taking down questions on the YouTube channel. And so even those questions will be presented to you, Dr. Benton. With this, I think with no further ado, I start with the session for today. Okay, am I not audible? I'm audible? Okay. Shivani, can you please check, because Professor Benton says that he can hear me. Can you please check what's wrong with your speaker or your loudspeaker? Okay, fine. So I think we start with today. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you all to the first lecture of the online lecture series being initiated by the Pune Mumbai student chapter of the Paleontological Society of India. A very warm welcome to Professor Benton, who accepted our invitation to do us the honors of starting these series. The Pune Mumbai students chapter was started at the Pune University under the active and unwavering support of our Vice Chancellor, Professor Nitin Karmalkar, who, as a geologist, is also the president of this chapter. This chapter was started in response to the appeal of its parent body, the Paleontological Society of India, for collective efforts to highlight and propagate the relevance, importance, and recent trends in paleontology amongst the younger generation of geologists, paleontologists, archaeologists, and its allied disciplines. With science becoming more and more interdisciplinary, and the relevance of climate change and environment finding ways into the rooms of policymakers and technologists alike, there is a need to discuss renewed perspectives about paleontology to a larger forum. The pandemic-induced lockdown has just given us that time and opportunity. Even if our routines and economies have slowed down, virtual platforms of connecting have given us the opportunity to meet and interact in large numbers with stalwarts across the country and the globe. Taking this opportunity, we initiate this lecture series by a very interesting talk by a world-renowned paleontologist and speaker, Professor Mike Benton. Can I request Mugdha, our PhD scholar, to please formally introduce our speaker for today, Professor Michael Benton. Mugdha,
Yes.
can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Hello and good afternoon to everyone. Dr. Michael James Benton, a Fellow of Royal Society and Fellow of Royal Society of Edinburgh, is a British paleontologist and professor of vertebrate paleontology in the School of Earth Sciences at the University of Bristol. His PhD, awarded in 1981 by the University of Newcastle, dealt with the Triassic reptile from Elkin, functional morphology and relationships. His published work mostly concentrates on the evolution of Triassic reptiles, but he is also working on extinction events and the faunal changes in the fossil record. His interests include the diversification of life through time, quality of fossil record, shapes of phylogens, age-clad congruence, mass extinctions, Triassic ecosystem evolution, basal diapside phylogen, basal archosaur, and the origin of the dinosaurs. His current research project focuses on the end Permian mass extinction, the greatest mass extinction of all time, and especially its effect on terrestrial organisms and the recovery from devastation. He is also working on large-scale aspects of dating the tree of life, the use of phylogenetic means to assess the quality of rock and fossil records, and studying the macroevolution using phylogenetic comparative approaches and morphometrics. In December 2010, Professor Benton had a rhinoceros Bottlenecks named in his honor. He delivered a landmark TED Talk on mass extinction and the future of life on Earth, which has more than 80,000 views on YouTube. Professor Benton is the author of several paleontology textbooks and children's books. He has also advised on many media productions, including BBC's Walking with Dinosaurs, and was a program consultant for Paleo World on Discovery Science. He has contributed to some documentaries. Of this was to BBC's 2002 program, The Day Earth Nearly Died, which features scientists and deals with mysteries of Permian extinction. It is indeed a privilege to have a person of such wide acclaim amongst us today. We are truly grateful that he accepted our invitation to talk to us on the topic recovery of life from the greatest mass extinction of all time, and also gave us insight about the topic with respect to the ongoing mass extinction. Sir, with no further ado, I request you to kindly deliver your lecture.
Thank you, Ms. Ambakar, and thank you, Dr. Panchang. That was wonderful. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very sorry I cannot be there in person. When I was last in India, I visited Kolkata for the ceremonies at the Indian Statistical Institute in honor of Prasanta Mahalanobis. And I enjoyed my time there very much. I've worked on fossil reptiles from the Triassic of the UK, and some of them are very, very similar to Indian specimens from the Pranita Godavari Valley. Very, very similar animals, which reminds us, of course, in these times I'm going to talk about, animals could walk over the whole Earth. And of course, all of the continents were fused together as Pangaea. And in fact, the distance from the UK to India was much less at that time than it is now. So I'm going to talk about the recovery of life, and I hope there's a sort of message behind the talk, which will be something about the knowledge that geologists and paleontologists can derive from their fieldwork, but which can be of great importance in terms of tackling some of the big questions of today. In other words, the climate crisis and the risk of extinction of life today. So when we look back at the history of life on Earth, which can sometimes be represented in this kind of way, this is a diagram showing the geological record of the Phanerozoic, the last 600 million years or so, the Vendian here, and the diversity of life in the sea, this classic diagram from Setkosky 1984. And the two things that stand out are that, of course, over time, life has got more diverse. So life today is more diverse than it was in the Cambrian. But secondly, that there was a very big event at this point here, a big drop in diversity, which corresponds to the boundary of the Permian and the Triassic. And this dates from about 250 million years ago. Many people have worked on the evidence for the extinction, the physical geological evidence and the paleontological evidence in many parts of the world. And my purpose here is not to talk about the evidence for this killing model. I'll simply present it. And if you're interested to follow up, there are many review papers covering all of this, because of course I'm focusing on the recovery. So we accept the extinction happened. But the model overall starts at the top in red with the Siberian Traps eruptions. So these were enormous basalt eruptions that were happening over a huge area of Russia. And they're equivalent, of course, to the similarly catastrophic events documented in the Deccan Traps in India, but they date from the end of the Cretaceous. These are at the end of the Permian. And the consequences of these eruptions were the production of a great number of gases. some of which produce cooling, some of which are greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane, and they produce warming. But of course, also, these gases, when they mix with water in the atmosphere, they produce acid, sulfuric acid. And so one of the killing environmental changes was acid rain, and that led to soil erosion because it killed the plants. And just in some parts of the world where forests are being removed, one of the consequences is catastrophic erosion, which of course in itself can contribute to huge extinction. And the CO2 and methane gave a sharp burst of global warming at that time. And indeed, this process repeated several times. But the warming as well contributed to extinction by causing blooms in the oceans, and then anoxia, lack of oxygen, and then marine mass extinction, mainly as a result of the warming, but also possibly some ocean acidification as well. And terrestrial mass extinctions probably caused by the acid rain plus the warming. And the evidence of the magnitude of the event is not only from the kind of global scale databases that Jack Sepkoski and others accumulated, but you can also see it at the local level. And so these images are based on evidence from China, but you would find the same evidence in Canada, in Pakistan, in the Spiti Valley, and other locations, where immediately before the event, in other words, in the very top of the Permian, these are the kinds of rocks that you find. This is a bioclastic limestone, completely built of the skeletons of reef-building organisms, and there's a kind of diversity, a local diversity of dozens and dozens of species here. Whereas just a few centimeters higher in the rock section at the beginning of the Triassic, the rock type changes from bioclastic limestone to a dark mudstone, and the fossils are very rare. Not only are they rare, but they represent a low diversity community, maybe 5 or 6 species at most. All of this range of forms have gone. The complexity of the ecosystem has collapsed. And then finally, we use the term cosmopolitan in the case of paleoecology to mean that these fossils are the same everywhere around the world. So instead of having species that are unique in each marine basin, suddenly all you get are these 5 or 6 species, and they are absolutely the same all over the world. So life has collapsed at all different levels, the local level, the regional level, the global level, however you measure it. This is a massive loss of diversity. And in some of the best documented sections in South China, the local figure is confirmed at the regional scale as being a loss of 90% of species. And in fact, the evidence from China suggests that it may have happened in 2 events, one near the end of the Permian. So here is the Permian-Triassic boundary here. These are conodont zones, which are international zones that can be correlated. And the Chinese sections contain various ash deposits, so exact age dates can be got. And these indicate that the spacing between events A and B could be somewhere between 60 and 100,000 years. So the precision of dating is pretty amazing. And then I should say each of these vertical lines represents the duration of a single species. So there's something like documentation of over 500 species of marine organisms here, showing extinction is happening all the time, but there are a couple of steps of dramatic extinction at A and B. And the conditions that brought that about are shown here by this summary carbon isotope curve. So this was published a number of years ago by Jonathan Payne, and people have worked on it since, but the pattern is the same. That the carbon isotopes show a sharp negative excursion at the boundary, and that corresponds to a time of dramatic temperature rise, which can be measured from the oxygen isotopes. And then what was surprising, what Payne found surprisingly, was that About 1 million years later, there was another spike, carbon spike, and then another one, and then another one. So there were at least 4 carbon spikes over the course of the early Triassic. And this means that life was hit time and again by some combination of the eruptions and production of carbon dioxide, methane, sharp global warming, acid rain. And of course, this is why people are, I can now say, this is why people see this as very informative or potentially informative for the present day. Because although, of course, we're not looking at carbon dioxide and methane today necessarily coming from huge volcanic eruptions, it doesn't matter where it comes from. If it comes from the exhaust pipe of a car or from a polluting factory, the CO2 and the methane, or from a cow, the CO2 and the methane are coming into the atmosphere anyway. And of course, looking at this kind of event, we can see the consequences or the possible consequences. And one of those consequences was suggested by Sun in 2012, which was a so-called dead zone. And he noted that in the earliest Triassic, here's the world as it was, the supercontinent Pangaea, and you're sitting here somewhere. India is part of Gondwana. I'm here. But of course, you could then walk over land across what is now Africa between the two. And so many of the land-living animals are the same all over the world. But the key point that Sun discovered was that here is the paleo-equator, and he mapped the occurrences of terrestrial vertebrates and shallow water fish. And particularly in the southern part, he found there was a wide zone, a dead zone with apparently nothing living. And we have tried to test that a little bit by looking at the wider record of skeletons and footprints. Here is the paleo-equator. And by measuring the skeletons and footprints, we were able to show it's a little more subtle than he suggested. But there still does seem to be some kind of a dead zone, particularly in the southern tropics of the Triassic, meaning nothing living. And that's the effect of raising the temperatures by about 10 degrees. If you go from a tropical sea temperature of 25 or 30 degrees up to 40, nothing in the ocean wants to live in a temperature of 40 degrees. It's just too much. And the duration of the killing time can be seen from this diagram here, which has the pain isotope curve again. Here is the PT boundary at this point, the early Triassic, about 5 million years. So Payne had identified that there was a span of maybe 6 or 7 million years of perturbed environments as indicated by the isotopes. And that matches long gaps in the record. On land, there's a so-called coal gap where there is no coal, and that reflects the absence of trees, the absence of forests. And in the oceans, there's a chert gap and a coral gap, indicating the absence of life in the deep oceans and the shallow oceans. And this time of perturbation of the environment is matched by a time of absence of coral reefs, absence of forests. So the recovery took a long time, but for a whole variety of reasons. So I'll show you a little bit of a more detailed study in South China, and then we'll come back to how this relates to loss of life in the present day. So some of you will be aware that there's been a huge amount of attention paid recently by geologists around the world to the geology of South China. And this whole zone from Shanghai, which is somewhere here, across into Yunnan province, which is over here, it documents in great detail mainly the marine rock record through this time. So here is the Permian and the Triassic, and there are many, many rock sections all over South China, which can be correlated together, and they overlap to produce a very continuous rock record of maybe 3 or 4 kilometers of rock, representing most of the Triassic, so maybe 40 or 50 million years of time. So this is a great resource for tracking the isotopes and the fossils. I'll show you one example. This was my first experience in South China, maybe 10 years ago. We went to this locality called Loping. I don't know what that blue thing is, which has suddenly appeared. Oh, somebody's scribbling on the screen somehow. Don't worry about that. This photograph, I was told before I went to this location that the Chinese students had quarried away half a hill. And yes, they have quarried away half a hill. So here you're looking at a section through maybe 1 million years of time in the early part of the middle Triassic, and every layer is full of fossils. And so here are some examples of the fossils showing predatory fish, ichthyosaurs, marine reptiles. There's land-derived organisms like insects, millipedes, and plants. There are limulids, king crabs, and all kinds of fish and jelly, sea urchins. So a great diversity of life. And in fact, the Chinese colleagues had collected maybe 20,000 fossils showing all of this rather exceptional preservation and a mix of mainly marine life, shallow marine life, but also some terrestrial. Here's a very nice reconstruction that was made to show the fishes and reptiles. And this dates from about 7 or 8 million years into the Triassic. So we were making a claim, this is a more or less recovered ecosystem. Life has more or less recovered. And if you want to read more about it, we did a review in Earth Science Reviews in 2013, and it has these beautiful color paintings by Brian Chu. Just briefly, moving up through time, the record is fantastic, showing this is now about 6 or 7 million years later in the Triassic. A great diversity of fossil reptiles, and some of these, like Chytiosaurus here, this little one, there are thousands and thousands of specimens. They're just amazingly abundant. And then finally, the Guanling fauna, which is yet again another 5 million years younger. Very unusual. It consists of many quite large marine reptiles, some of them maybe 10 meters in length. So they've got really big. That's a sign of sort of ecosystem maturity. And then these extraordinary things are floating logs of wood. So clearly forests have come back, carrying crinoids, sea lilies. And these are very long. Some of them are maybe 20 meters in length. And then in amongst these are living all kinds of life, the earliest turtles, lots of fish, ammonites, etc., etc. And we can sort of picture the recovery of life as in the form of so-called food webs, expanding food webs. And a food web, of course, is just a way to try to link the different creatures according to their diets. So in this case, the main food sources are the mollusks and arthropods, and even some of the fishes. And these are the survivors of the extinction. And then in the early Triassic, we get a variety of marine reptiles which are feeding upon these, including placodonts, which are specialists on crushing mollusks. And then in the Anisian, which corresponds to Loping, this is now about 7 or 8 million years after the extinction, we add another level in purple, which are larger predators that feed upon the smaller predators that feed upon these. So the food web is kind of building up in some way. We can also get a great deal of information from the phylogeny of all of these fossil creatures. And so there's the Chinese locations, here's Loping. So each of these red lines is one of these biotas or fossil Lagerstätten. And they're dated against the Triassic timescale, early Triassic. So the mass extinction is here. And the various fish are found in these different sites of exceptional preservation. We can draw the phylogenetic tree to show the relationships of all of those, and then we can begin to look at rates of change. And we can do the same for the reptiles. We can see that they're diversifying like the fish, diversifying really quite fast. It seems they originate just at the boundary, they're part of the recovery, and there's a kind of explosion of diversity because, of course, remember that 90% or more of species had gone extinct during the extinction event. So we're kind of characterizing the recovery in different ways. We've looked at it in terms of ecosystems or food webs. Here we are looking at it in terms of macroevolution, the evolution of the group. And indeed, just to remind you, macroevolution, meaning big evolution, is a term that paleontologists often use to describe the kinds of aspects of evolution that we have access to because of the fossil record. And we often start with a kind of evolutionary tree. This is an evolutionary tree of the dinosaurs. And I think this kind of thing is fairly familiar, even in children's books. And in the last 20 years, there have been massive improvements in our knowledge of the fossil record. The quality of dating is improving, the precision is improving a lot. And there are good examples I showed in the Chinese sections where we can talk about thousands of years, which would have been impossible a few years ago. We have phylogenetic trees. They're a great resource for trying to look at evolution. And of course, computational tools. I'll only mention this briefly. I won't go into a lot of detail, but just to show what's possible. And part of this improvement of knowledge involves a crossover to the present day. So a number of years ago, for example, we produced a so-called super tree, meaning a huge tree made up of a huge amount of published data for the dinosaurs, 500 species. And so that's a purely paleontological example. And each of these is a species of dinosaur. And if you look at it in detail, it gives you the relationships and all the way down to the origin here at the center. But biologists are doing just the same thing. So here, for example, is a complete super tree of birds, all 10,000 species. And if you want to know who is related to what, it's all kind of summarized in there. But when you have a super tree like that, it's a fantastic resource. And very importantly, I want to stress this, it provides a crossover from the geological record to the present day. So it means that we could add these two together, for example, because birds evolved from dinosaurs, and we could take the fossil record of birds deep into time by combining those and then looking at rates of change. Here's a small example using the phylogenetic comparative method. We're looking for all sorts of things. This is back to the Permian-Triassic timescale. I've already shown you that various groups of marine reptiles radiated, diversified very fast after the extinction. It also seems that the origin of mammals can be traced back to that point. There was a great explosion of these cynodonts, and then eventually they evolved into mammals at the end of the Triassic. And this tree here is generated by a computational program where I have made the phylogeny of all these different beasts, and Morgan Eucodon is one of the first mammals. And then I've coded a number of indicators of endothermy. And so this is in this case, is an informal degree of endothermy where the mammal, the hot-bodied, warm-blooded animal is at this end in red, and the cold-blooded reptilian type is at the blue end. And this is trying to begin to document how essentially cold-blooded animals became warm-blooded by the acquisition of hair and higher metabolic rates, etc. But this is the kind of calculation that we can now do. Characters of the ancestors, the hypothetical ancestors at each of these points. And then you can compare the patterns that emerge with different kinds of evolutionary trees, different kinds of models of evolution. Brownian motion is stochastic or random, early burst, trend, constraint. These are different ways that things can evolve. And the other thing we can do is to compare species evolution with evolution of form. And we sometimes use the term diversity to mean species richness, and disparity to mean the range of morphology. And so in a case like this, you might be looking at some gastropods, and you can see that these 4 gastropods have very different shapes. this high-spired one, this very open aperture one, these sort of loosely coiled ones in between. And it doesn't matter whether these are different species or not, but we might want to describe the form. And in this case, in fact, the form can be described by these 3 different characters. And I won't give you the detail, but it allows you to measure 3 features of each or any gastropod. And then you can describe that in terms of the range of morphology. And that's measured kind of independent of your estimate of species diversity, taxonomy. So here's one example that we looked at a few years ago for recovery. And this fossil at the bottom is Lystrosaurus, a very famous fossil from the earliest Triassic. It was one of the first tetrapods to recover. Specimens are known from South Africa, India, China, Russia, South America. So Lystrosaurus was very common in each of those places. It was cosmopolitan because you find it in each different part of the world. And this has all the characteristics of a disaster taxon, or a survivor. It was one of the few beasts that survived. And who knows why? I guess it was just lucky. Some people have tried to find unique characters to say this was a super beast of some kind, but I don't think so. It's a very humble plant eater, about 2 meters in length, and it just survived. And because it survived, it was successful for a short time. And so the evolution of the wider group of dicynodonts is quite unusual. They were the dominant plant eaters in the late Permian. And this is a spindle diagram where the width of the black shape is meant to represent the numbers of genera. So this is the diversity. So they were very diverse here with about 50 or 60 genera around the world. And in their faunas, they were very abundant. They dwindle a bit, they nearly go extinct. 3 or 4 survive, including Lystrosaurus. And this is what we call an evolutionary bottleneck, because it's like the neck of a bottle. And only 2 or 3 species survive. But then the extraordinary thing was the dicynodonts came back. They were nearly killed off, but they just survived. And then they recovered. And they became pretty dominant herbivores again in the middle Triassic. So this is the recovery time and the bottleneck. And so we were interested in the question of what did these Triassic dicynodonts look like in comparison to these Permian ones? And our hypothesis was they might look very different because whereas these were very diverse and came from many different backgrounds, these all just evolved from the 1 or 2 surviving species. Here's the data. There are many, many examples of these. Here's the detailed time scale and the Permian Triassic boundary in red. You can see there's a kind of gap here where there's a few survivors. They're pretty rare. A lot of them go extinct. And then they kind of recover around this level. So that's the data. We have a phylogenetic tree. And again, on the time scale, the PT boundary. Here is Lystrosaurus, which survives, but notice it goes extinct. And here's another one that survived, but it goes extinct. And in fact, there's only 2 species over here that gave rise to this later diversification here. So that's the other bit of data that we have, which is a phylogenetic tree. And then putting those together with measurements of the morphology, we were able to show in this morphospace. So this is a principal coordinate analysis, which is like a principal component analysis. And early on in my talk, I mentioned Prasanta Mahalanobis. I must remind you that Mahalanobis was one of the world founders of these kinds of multivariate statistical methods. One of my first jobs when I was a student was to do these kinds of analyses, and we used the Mahalanobis D statistic. I hope you've all heard of that, and if you haven't, you must look it up. The Mahalanobis D statistic is a way of measuring the distance or the amount of difference between one cluster of points in multidimensional space versus another cluster. So you find the center here and here, And the Mahalanobis d squared is the distance, effectively. Is there more distance between these two clusters than the amount of variation within each of them? That's just a little aside. The point is that the Permian dicynodonts occupy quite a large amount of morphospace, whereas the Triassic ones occupy a lot less, shown in blue. And in fact, this is one of those survivors, Myosaurus, and it didn't give rise to any later form. So if you delete this one, because it's effectively a Permian one that just crept into the Triassic, had a look around and went extinct. The Triassic forms then, as a whole, occupy a very tight area of morphospace. That tells you two things. Number one, they are morphologically very, very similar to each other. Even though they got to be quite diverse, they are virtually all the same. Whereas the Permian ones were very different in morphology and maybe in ecology. And secondly, overall, the amount of morphospace they occupy is much reduced. Even though the number of species is similar, the amount of morphospace is much reduced. We can use these methods also to explore the relative fates of different groups as we go from Permian to Triassic. So here are two major groups through the Triassic. This is the Permian mass extinction. They are about equal as they cross into the Triassic. And then the mammal-like reptiles, the therapsids, they get smaller and smaller. This is a measurement of body size. This is time. And so from the start, at the beginning of the Triassic, both groups have about the same mean body size. And then these ones, including the dicynodonts, just get smaller and smaller and smaller until we get to the origin of mammals here at the end of the Triassic. Whereas this group get bigger and bigger, and these give rise to the dinosaurs. And so there was a question of whether they were somehow competing between the groups and were the relative sizes somehow connected. But the study by Sukias and colleagues using phylogenetic comparative methods showed that the rate of change was quite slow, and that in fact you could not say that this was an example of a driven trend. We get to the age of dinosaurs. This is not from a paleontology textbook, I can assure you. This is from some kind of game. These people here were not in existence in the late Triassic. But it's important to remember that the end Permian mass extinction here gave the opportunity for the archosauromorphs to rise in diversity. And just as in the oceans, new groups of fishes and new groups of marine reptiles became important, on land, the dinosaurs and the ancestors of crocodiles, for example, became quite important by the end of the Triassic. And new knowledge in the last 10 years is that whereas it was thought the dinosaurs originate here in the late Triassic, in fact, tracks and now other fossils show us that they originate in the early Triassic. So in fact, the origin of dinosaurs is triggered by the horror show of the end Permian mass extinction. And this applies across all types of fossil records. And I showed you a different version of this diagram at the start, but it's very clear that, oops, some nuisance call, forgive me. It's very clear at the end of the Permian that there was a major change in the faunas, and we go from Paleozoic types of organisms to modern type. And so it wasn't only the dinosaurs and crocodiles and mammals and turtles and other modern forms that got going in here, it's also sharks and gastropods and insects and bivalves and lobsters and all kinds of other modern marine forms as well. Now, what can we say about the impact of a mass extinction on life? And one of the most famous impacts has been called the Lilliput effect. It's a lovely name. And it comes from Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, where Gulliver, who is supposed to be a European person going to distant lands, comes upon a land that is full of tiny people. And it's called the land of the Lilliput people, and they tie him down and so on. And so the Lilliput effect, and this is a nice example from China, where before the extinction, these are the average sizes of brachiopods. after the extinction, they are about 1/10 of the size. And you just cannot find any large forms at all. And in fact, in the earliest part of the Triassic, they are really tiny. So this seems to be quite common. The size gets smaller, the extinction event, the reduction in size. And it could either be that the big ones simply die out and only the little ones survive, or it could be that they all get smaller. And it seems to be more this one, that a lot of the big ones do die out, but mainly it's that all of them get smaller. So they go along and woof, they get smaller and they survive. Probably because of the reduced productivity, the reduced amount of food. How to survive? This is now where we switch to the modern day. What do we learn from the fossil record that helps us to understand what's happening today? One thing I'm not going to talk about is the physical drivers of extinction, because I hinted at that earlier. Of course, a lot of the physical drivers in the past are the same as they are today. For example, the large amounts of greenhouse gases, the high levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That can have two effects. It can obviously have a warming effect, as we well know today, and that has happened in the past many times, for example, at this point, but also can lead to acidification. We know that if you pump different gases into the atmosphere, they will mix with rainwater. And of course, this is commonplace in many big industrial cities. The rain, when it falls, stings your eyes because it is acid. That's as simple as it is. And of course, acid is not pleasant for life. It kills life, both on land and in the oceans. On land, of course, it will kill trees. We're familiar with the way the leaves disappear and the tree eventually gets killed. And if the tree dies, eventually the rainfall will wash away the soil because the trees fix the soil onto the landscape. In the oceans, many organisms have skeletons built of calcium carbonate, like mollusks and echinoderms and crustaceans. And so that if you acidify the ocean, it will simply reduce the calcium carbonate and remove the skeleton, and that kills the organisms. How to survive? Number one, definitely, be widely distributed. Live everywhere, all over the world. So we're like cockroaches, we're everywhere, and that means we have a good start to survival. Be a food generalist, be willing to eat everything. So pandas are the classic example of a species that are far too specialized, living on bamboo shoots, and it's a very marginal kind of diet anyway. Preferably be small. That's where the cockroach wins, and even the pigeon. Or at least don't be too big. So human size is about at the top end of a sensible size range. These often go together because I think it's well known in ecology that large animals such as elephants and tigers require large territories and lots of food. And that means they are liable to extinction if there is pressure on the space that is available or the amount of food. And we have to remember that from biology, the genetics of the case are, the ecology of the case are, that if you're very large, you tend to live at small population sizes. So they are vulnerable, whereas cockroaches, pigeons, and to some extent humans have big population sizes. We survive. And of course, when conditions are harsh, there is a loss of food, it may get hot, it may get cold, if you are unable to adapt. And of course, remember, organisms don't just sit still when the temperature rises or falls, they move. But of course, as we saw in the Triassic example, if you live in the tropics and temperatures get very hot, you have to leave the tropics. And then the tropics become empty of life. And of course, we know today in the oceans and on land, the tropics are where there is most life. Maybe half of all life today lives in quite a narrow latitudinal band around the tropics, both in the oceans, particularly in coral reef settings, and on land, particularly in tropical rainforests. Oops, keep flipping slides. But the thing we have to recall about certain times, and I don't think this is what we're facing at the moment, but at times of real crisis where the change is super rapid, then maybe none of these rules of survival count. Because often mass extinctions are characterized as bad luck, not bad genes. Or the field of bullets. People think of the First World War, where the soldiers would climb out of the trenches and run towards the enemy. And it didn't matter how well fed you were, or how strong you were, or how bright or clever you were. If you were facing machine gun bullets, you're all going to be killed. And so that would be probably what happened at the end of the Permian. Everything was killed because the physical crisis was so brutal. And so it was bad luck, not bad genes. But during normal times, good genes having characteristics for survival, in other words, these kinds of characteristics are quite important. So let's put this into practice. And one of the themes behind my lecture, see how we can link from the geological past through to the present. Because I want everybody listening, and most of you will be geologists of some kind with a traditional classic geology, paleontology training. And it's very important that we have the confidence to know that we should be speaking to policymakers and to climate and ecology modelers and to biologists who are concerned about biodiversity. Because what was a big divide when I started is no longer a big divide. We can do a lot of studies that cross the boundary between the present day and the past. And a lot of things that used to embarrass us. Ecologists used to say, oh, your geological dating is just so poor, you can't follow processes and events. Or they would say you can't apply the models and heavy computational methods that we apply. All of those caveats have gone. We can apply precise dating. We can apply complex modeling and computational approaches, and I've shown you a few, which cross over absolutely completely between the past and the present day. And of course, when we look at the last extinction event, big extinction event at the end of the Pleistocene, which mainly just affected the Northern Hemisphere, it's not a mass extinction, but it's still a big enough event. And it's connected with the end of the Ice Age, and animals like these saber-toothed cats and mammoths, which were adapted to living in the really cold conditions of northern Eurasia and North America, went extinct about 11,000 years ago. And 11,000 years at one point is part of geology. We talk about it comfortably because the Pleistocene is a geological period. But 11,000 years is within the range of modern climate modeling and records of climate in ice cores and carbon isotope records. And indeed, it's within the range of DNA. So people get DNA from saber-toothed cats and mammoths, and so that they can connect the knowledge of population structures from the present day to the past. So this example is to remind us that we have events as well. It's not just the methods. And then we can move through into the human era where, for example, we have documentation of extinctions of birds on some of the Hawaiian islands in the Pacific, and all these wonderful and enjoyable creatures were known 1,000 years ago, but they have gone, mainly because many people have occupied these islands and destroyed the forests. And these, of course, fail all the rules about don't be too specialized. These are very specialized. Look at their beaks. They all had very specific diets, and they often would live only in a small population in one corner of one of the islands. So you only have to cut down a few thousand trees and dozens of species totally go extinct. So putting together this information, it is possible to have some knowledge of historical extinctions. So this is not going back as far as the Pleistocene, but applying the kinds of methods that paleontologists use. And so this graph is maybe not so clear, dates from 1600 through to the present day. And this is showing the number of species of birds and mammals and other well-known groups that go extinct. And of course, as you would expect, the curve is rising. These are only documented or dated extinctions, like the dodo from Mauritius Island. People know when the last examples were seen, so you can put a date on that. I can't remember, 1650, 1670, something like that. And of course, during the time of human population expansion around the globe and expanded travel and exploration, people have settled on islands and gone to places and perturbed the ecology in various ways. But of course, being able to collect that information gives us a baseline of knowledge that we can use to try to answer the questions of, well, what is the current rate of extinction? And there was a very useful review a few years ago, if you're interested to follow it up. This was a kind of position, a world position statement in Nature, 2014. I think it's available free of charge on the Nature website. Monastersky is a ecology biodiversity writer, and he tried to put together all the data from around the world. And these are the documented extinctions. Sorry. Showing the numbers of extinctions of mammals in red and birds in blue and various other groups. And so the numbers don't look too high. This is documenting a total of 765 extinct species. But we then have to try and put that into proportion because this is a minimal number. These are just the numbers where we have documentation. What about all the cases where birds and mammals and other things have gone extinct and nobody was there to see it? We'd never discovered them and described them, and they go extinct before they've been given a name. And then there are, what about all the other groups? These are the organisms that we see and we're interested in. People are interested in birds and mammals. And so we think we have pretty good knowledge of those. But what about all the spiders and bugs and even microscopic organisms? We know almost nothing about their diversity. So what is the current rate of extinction loss? We can work out from this plot that the rate is something like 0.1 to 0.3% per annum, which sounds kind of low, but then if you turn it around, 0.3% per annum, multiply that by 3 and everything is extinct within 300 years. Not good. And another way to look at it is 0.3% of birds and mammals can be scaled to the total diversity of life. So it's estimated there are something like 10 million species on Earth today. So that's actually saying that 0.3% of 10 million is a loss of 30,000 species per annum, which scales to 80 species per day. So if some of you have come across political documents and other campaigning data which give you a figure of 78 or 80 species going extinct every day, this is where it comes from. It's not a random figure that people have guessed about. It's based on our knowledge of the well-documented groups. You take a figure of 0.3% per annum and you scale it up to all of life, and there it is. That's undeniable. Admittedly, this is a high-end figure, and we have to be careful because, of course, the species that have gone extinct, people could say, and they'd be quite right, tend to be the vulnerable species. And vulnerable species are those that live at small population size, have very specialist diets, and are there and small population, and therefore things like those Hawaiian birds and the dodo, etc., etc. So you could say, okay, we need to rescale this in some way. And there are many efforts to try and rescale it. The 0.3% figure then is perhaps too high. And we have to think about cockroaches and humans because maybe we're just killing off the vulnerable species at one end of the distribution, a long hollow curve distribution of species. And therefore the rate of extinction is actually less than that. So are there other ways of getting at that? So what would be a normal rate of extinction? So the point here is that we expect some extinction. I mean, clearly no species lasts forever. And so typically it's estimated that each species on Earth has a duration of about 1 million years. And so that if there are, for example, 20 million species on Earth, we don't know really, 10 million, 20 million, then we expect in normal times to see 20 extinctions per year. That is 20 million divided by the duration of 1 million. So over a span of 1 million years, all 20 million species should disappear. And so in the course of 1 year, we get 20 extinctions, which is trivial out of a total population of 10 or 20 million. That corresponds to one extinction every 18 days, blah, blah, blah. And so that's another way, another end of estimating what the regular extinction ought to be. So we have something between 0.5 of an extinction per day as a normal rate, and a top-end extinction rate of 80. So we're going from this figure of maybe 80, that's a very pessimistic view, versus a minimal rate of 0.5 per day. And so that gives you the kind of range within which we have to estimate. And at the moment, there is no agreed figure because of the complexity of deriving. We can get this sort of normal rate of extinction, that is assuming no human intervention. But clearly the rate of extinction we are experiencing is more than 20 per year. 20 per year is a very low figure. So I leave that kind of open. I can't give you a final answer there, but if you're interested, you can follow up in the references mentioned and look at the way people calculate the rates. And so I'll summarize that in the last 20 or 30 years, our subject, geology, paleontology, has advanced enormously in our ability to study events in the past. And a lot of what I've told you was really not very well known 20 or 30 years ago. If you look at an older textbook, I remember when I was a student, we were told even that the extinction at the end of the Permian might have taken 10 million years. Now we're saying it took 60,000 years. Wow, 10 million, 60,000, that's quite a change. And secondly, people have done the in-depth studies at regional scale, like the one I showed you from China, but people have done some similar studies from many other parts of the world. And that gives us a considerable amount of confidence in describing the pattern of what happened. But what's exciting now is we're able to talk about the processes. We need to distinguish pattern and process. Pattern is simply what rocks occur where, and what ages are those rocks, and likewise which fossils occur and where are they, and we can make lists of fossils in each stratigraphic formation. But to understand processes, we need to go beyond that. And of course, for example, that model I showed at the very start, showing the hypothesis of the chain of events that led to the crisis at the end of the Permian, that's a process that is based on evidence. But of course, it's a kind of declaration that I would have been told when I was a student 30 years ago. This is crazy, don't do that. People will say you were a wild man with crazy ideas. But I think it's a good thing that geologists are daring and willing to put together the data to present a process model. Because of course, then that feeds into climate modeling and some of the computational approaches that we can now use. And I think people know that climate models were first worked out to understand modern weather, and now they have been adapted to model climate patterns in the past. And that allows us, by inputting geological data, to understand the nature of these crisis events, such as the overheating in the early Triassic, that dead zone. What's the world really like if you raise temperatures everywhere by 10 degrees? It's not enough just to look at that at a single locality. And you can't just map it out in a simple way by just adding 10 degrees, because the world works, the climate, the atmosphere works in a much more complex manner. And then likewise in paleontology, I've tried to show a few examples where we can use classical methods to plot range charts of the kind that we use in biostratigraphy. And that exercise has always, and that's something that we have done for 150 years, that exercise is a basic tool in geology for mapping and understanding the distribution of rocks around the world. And of course, it feeds into economic aspects of understanding where to find oil and stuff like that. But we can, and therefore people have developed very precise and very advanced ways of making age models using radiometric dating coupled with biostratigraphy. And that whole field has advanced enormously in the last 20 or 30 years. That can now marry with the advanced approaches that modern biologists, ecologists are taking to understand biodiversity and ecology of the Earth today. And we can now use a lot of their tools to apply to ancient examples. And I've tried to sort of show you the kinds of studies we can do in deep time at the end of the Permian, early Triassic, for example, and we can present them in ways that biologists understand what we're talking about. We can test hypotheses about what are the characteristics of these successful creatures and these unsuccessful ones. And then, of course, we have cases like the end Pleistocene, where we can make direct linkages through from the past to the present. And so I think that this is a very important area of research for the next decades. And I think new generations of paleontologists and geologists will have more and more involvement in these kinds of programs. And of course, these are research programs that are often ideal for collaborative international funding. And we see big efforts through the United Nations, but also through individual nations connecting with each other to try to work on these very daring areas. So I will stop, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Benton. I have a lot of questions here for you. And the first question, I'm going to actually unmute Professor Parcha. Professor Suraj Kumar Parcha is from the Wadia Institute of, sir, you can unmute yourself. Dr. Parcha, you can unmute yourself. He is from the Wadia Institute of Himalayan Geology, and he has also been working on these successions of the Tethian section of the Guriol ravine at Kashmir in Spiti. So I would actually ask him to, sir, you can actually unmute yourself. Okay, sir, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I am just, yes, I hear. First of all, I thank you, Professor Benton, to give us such an elaborative and vast experience lecture, which is very useful for us as well as for the next generation of students.
Thank you.
As you have said rightly in your lecture in the beginning, that we have a very good exposures in the Spiti Basin. But you are well aware that we have the very good section of Gurial ravine in Kashmir, which is PT boundary, which was once considered as GSSP also. But I started my career from the Cambrian onwards, but in recent years, I focused on PT boundary. And working on this, I focused on the Spiti Basin, Zanskar Basin, as well as in the Kashmir Basin. As you have said in the lecture, we are having a very carbonate thick sequence in this down below, and we have this mudstones, we have the black shales. But in this Kashmir Basin, we are getting some lamellibranchs, brachiopods, very tiny, as you have said in the lecture, that is affected of this extinction. But the boundary between Z1D and Z1E is just within 3 centimeters, which we have tried, though various groups are working on it. You might have seen the papers of the Brookfield and all these. I am also working with Christine. But unfortunately, we couldn't get any conodonts within this sequence from this region. Whereas in the Spiti Basin, we have where there's one iridium anomaly there. We have very thick, very small, just 2 centimeters sequence there, which demarcates between the two. Whereas in the Zanskar Basin, what we are finding that we don't have any such change, which it is unfortunately overlain by the Panjal trap. It is there. So it makes a very big question for me to correlate in all these 3 basins. What is your suggestion and how we have to proceed it? Because it is one of the important sections, as you are well aware. So I want your suggestion about this.
I don't have a great suggestion, I'm afraid. I know this kind of problem. Of course, you're right. The international section in Meishan is defined upon conodonts, and therefore many sections around the world can be correlated using the conodonts. I don't know what the other useful biostratigraphic fossils would be. I guess you have to look at faunas and overlaps and apply the normal classic biostratigraphic methods. I think you said there are some radiometric dates, so I guess if you are confident about the precision of the dates, that could help a little bit. Maybe in future, I think people are trying to use the carbon isotope curve as a source of signatures. because often it's very difficult, I know, with invertebrate fossils, which are quite long-lived, to match them to the conodontosomes, which are quite short. But I think people are beginning to accept there's a risk of a kind of circular argument, of course, but maybe it can be indicative that, as from the Jonathan Payne plot, there are maybe 4 spikes of carbon through the early Triassic, and maybe those could be used. And I guess the other independent method is magnetostratigraphy, because if that can be applied, there is certainly a lot of reversal of the Earth's magnetic pole during the time of the late Permian to early Triassic. But that's not enormously precise, because of course some of those bands of normal and reversed can be 500,000 years or something like that. So I don't have any miracle solution. I'm very sorry.
Okay.
But I have one thing. When you are saying that magnetostratigraphy, since the whole of the Himalayan sequence, particularly the Tethyan succession, it is a tectonically deformed. So we have to take all the precautions in this. I think you are right that we should go for the radiometric dating and the carbon dating. That will be isotope datings. That may help us.
Yeah. I hope it works.
Thank you, Dr. Pacha. I have a very interesting question here.
Thanks for lot.
Thank you, sir. Okay. I have this question from Dr. Randhir Singh from Birbal Sahni Institute of Paleobotany, Lucknow. He asks, does the end Permian mass extinction serve as a global deep time analog for modern deforestation and diversity loss?
I think in some ways that it can. Yes, this is a question about using it as a model. I think for a long time, people were focusing their effort on the end Cretaceous mass extinction. And there, a large part of the driver of the extinction was the impact of an asteroid. In some ways, that doesn't help us, though, because that is just a chance catastrophic event. But the end Permian, because the driver seems to be a production of greenhouse gases, then I think in that regard it can be. Admittedly, well, and also I guess because it's very fast. So although we talk about a span of maybe 60,000 years between the 2 pulses of extinction, it's still very difficult to be sure from the geological record how fast each of those spikes was. So you get a spike. Is that like 1 day or 1,000 years? That's very hard to tell. But I think people estimate that the rate of change of carbon in the atmosphere today is actually a catastrophic rate, because we're looking at a very fast rise over maybe 50 years, 100 years. So yes, I think it probably is a good analog. The only caveat is, of course, that the world was different and climates were different. So we have to keep that in mind. And I don't know whether that is a good thing or a bad thing in terms of the models we would have to work out for today.
Okay, there's this other question. You were just saying that people kept understanding, they wanted to reconstruct past environments to understand climate. But now people are also trying to understand how it affected biology. Climate cycles have been known to be there. There has been climate cyclicity, which has been identified. Is there any cyclicity observed in extinctions and evolutions? This question is by Dr. Rajiv Nigam from National Institute of Oceanography, Goa.
Thank you. Yes, that's a very good question. I think the question is about cyclicity and extinction. People have suggested high-level cyclicity, but I think the evidence for that is not very good. So this was at the level of 26 to 30 million year cycles. And that's been a very popular hypothesis, but the evidence is not very good. However, there is good evidence, I think, for Milankovitch scale cyclicity, which is well known in the rock record, and also seems to appear in the paleontological record, which is that in spans of maybe 20,000 years or 400,000 years and different points in between, we can see in the rock record that different cycles of deposition occur, and they may be marked by some big shift, and then it starts again. And perhaps that affects the climate. People have found that in evidence of advance and retreat of the cold conditions of the glaciation. And I think that can be detected in certain high quality rock records. So, but we don't yet know how that would affect evolution, because normally we don't have timescales that are good enough to be sure.
Okay. There's another question. You just said that we are losing almost 20 species every year, right? And we also saw that this rate of extinction has increased in the past, in the recent past. So would you really attribute it to preservation? Because the younger times are better preserved, and that's why we get more preservation of evidences. In the past, is it preservation, or how do you say that this is the fact?
Yes. So those estimates of extinction rate that I gave at the end, excuse me, they come only from the study of modern life. They've got nothing to do with geology. So they were based on estimates from the year 1600 onwards. So the dodo is the start. And so those are all based on biology, and the 20 extinctions a year would be a minimal background rate, because species don't last forever, and therefore every year some species will go extinct and be replaced. And the range is all the way through to 80 per day. That is a kind of maximum catastrophe rate based on our knowledge of historical extinction. So if you look at that article by Monastersky, it gives a lot more information, and those calculations then are nothing to do with the rock record. Yes, the questioner is quite right. If you're trying to calculate rates of extinction from the geological record, then we have less and less confidence the further back in time that you go.
There's this question by Dr. Kantimati Kulkarni from Agharkar Research Institute. She asks, what role does background extinction play in mass extinction?
Very good question. And I didn't give a full introduction to the idea of background extinction. Paleontologists talk about background extinction often as normal extinction. They'll say in normal times, these are the extinctions you see. And so I think it's important in understanding survival, where I talked about the characteristics of a successful organism, being a generalist, being widespread, having a broad range of diet, etc., etc. And normally those are the characters that help a species to survive. And then the contrast is during a mass extinction, all of those rules may break down. And then you may get the field of bullets effect, where it doesn't matter what your fitness value is, to use a genetic term, or what your ecological characters are. Everything gets killed. And there's no judgment or no quality in terms of the surviving plants and animals.
Okay. There's this other question by Dr. Vivesh Kapoor. He asks, is there any evidence of burrowing animals to survive better close to extinction boundaries, or maybe even the PT boundary?
Nice question. It seems to be a sensible thing. If the climate is changing or getting hotter, disappear into a burrow. It depends, of course, how long the crisis lasts. I mean, if the crisis is for a matter of days or weeks, that's a great thing to do, because you can keep cool, particularly if you have some food underground. The worry is that some of these events are just so huge. So people have found evidence of burrows around the PT boundary in South Africa, maybe some in India as well, where there clearly were reptiles that were sort of burrowing into the banks of rivers. I just don't know how well that would allow them to survive, though, if the really horrible conditions carry on for years and years and years. And I think it would be a good short-term survival tactic. But if, for example, at the beginning of the Triassic, there are no forests and the soil has gone and it's a kind of rocky landscape and there's very little food and it's actually extremely hot, then living in a burrow might not be really particularly helpful.
Okay, there's this other question. What do you think is more likely? Climate-induced extinction in the near future, or maybe the future? Climate-induced extinction, geological processes inducing extinction, or society-driven extinction? What do you see as the most recent coming up? This is by a PhD student, Abhilash.
Yeah. Thank you. I hope I'm not being too controversial by saying I think at the moment it's mainly human-induced. I think the effort of the amount of the amount of carbon that is going into the atmosphere from factories and farming and cars is enormous, and is much more than any amount of carbon that's coming from volcanoes and other natural causes. Of course, it doesn't matter in terms of the way the atmosphere works, whether it's carbon coming from human activity or from natural causes. It will still have the same effects in terms of temperature and acid rain and so on. And I think all the UN reports and all the studies that have come out recently, I mean, this is not my specialist area, but at least I try to read these things, they all agree. That the effect of human activity on introducing greenhouse gases is much greater than any other cause. And the other human effect, of course, is cutting down forests and destroying fisheries and all of those things that we all do. Everybody is equally to blame. And clearly, if you cut the size of a forest to 1/10, you are clearly going to kill life. There is no question.
Okay, there's this other question by Astha. She says that viruses have played a key role in microevolution in the past. So do you think that the current pandemic, the COVID crisis, is also playing a role towards the same?
I don't think I can say anything very intelligent about that. My son is a virologist, as it happens, so he is actually studying SARS-CoV-2, the name of the current virus. I think in the geological past, there must have been similar kinds of pandemics. And what we don't know about the current one is how many species can be involved. I think there's good evidence that the current SARS virus came from bats. And so there is species hopping. And this is something that viruses do, of course. If you're a virus, it's a great attribute to be able to hop from species to species, because the main duty in evolutionary terms of a virus is, of course, to survive and multiply. So I guess you could say that the current SARS virus is, in evolutionary terms, a very successful species. In terms of causing mass extinctions, that's a bit less certain, because normally viruses may hop from one species to another, and then there will be a long span of time before it hops to another species. So I can't think of evidence that there are viruses that can quickly infect a lot of species at the same time. So, but at the moment it's killing people, and it's obviously having a huge effect. But I suppose in terms of global population and the effect on the world and wildlife, I'm not sure what that is.
Okay. There's this question by Dr. Tisha Nagarkar. She asks, do species also go extinct as due to evolution? That is, in the course of, yes, and besides, how mass extinction has paved the path for hominids to evolve and flourish across continents?
Yes. So we have to remember at all times that extinction is a normal part of evolution. And I think another thing that paleontologists often say, which is true, is that the majority of species on Earth are extinct. So of course, we only know about one instant of time. The present day is only one instant of time. But life has existed on the Earth for billions of years. And so many huge numbers of species, millions and millions of species, have gone extinct. And it is estimated that each species will last on the Earth for about 1 million years. I think Homo sapiens is maybe 200,000 years old. So we've had about 1/5 of the duration of a typical species. And the normal thing in evolution is that either one species can evolve into another species. So over the course of time, there are many examples we know where species may split, or one will evolve into a different species. Or in other cases, a species may go extinct, particularly if it lives on an island or in a small area, and it may be in competition with another species. A new species arrives on the island, it competes, and the first species goes extinct. So extinction is a normal part of biological evolution.
Okay. You talked about the Lilliput effect, in which you said that when there was resurrection of life, the organisms were smaller and smaller. And that's why you also said it gives us clues of how we should live. We should live in all particular niches, move away, not live together, and all those kind of things. But smaller in size, but larger in abundance, doesn't it again take the same toll on the productivity that we're talking about?
Yes, because obviously these characters change during the extinction and recovery time. But I guess if you are small and abundant and widespread, and you have a random killing process, the chances of survival of a small number of those huge populations are higher. And so that's all. And I think the small size, I'm not suggesting that if there were an extinction, we would say that all small people will survive and large people will go extinct. This is more to do with bigger differences in size between species. But I think that if you have a small population size, there is a minimum viable level. So even if, for example, you have a population of elephants, if you kill half of them, the population may still survive. If you kill another half, it may still survive, but you're going from 100 to 50 to 25. And at some level, 25, they're doomed. They are doomed. They cannot survive any longer. But if you start with 1 million and cut to 500,000 and then 250,000, you can carry on cutting a long time and that species will survive.
Okay. There's this other question. If you see, we're talking about phylogeny, we're talking about understanding evolutionary trees. Somehow the morphological paleontology has been overtaken by molecular studies, right? And how relevant do you think morphological paleontology is still important, or is it obsolete and redundant?
I think we can answer that now in a very positive way. And we can say that many molecular biologists have realized that they cannot reconstruct evolution without the fossils. And there was a recent paper in Nature which pointed that out. It's kind of extremely bloody obvious if you're a paleontologist, but I think if you are not, it's easy to say we don't need fossils anymore. But the 2 points have been made. If you don't have any fossils, your molecular tree could be any depth because all the organisms are living at the present day. And you make your tree, but you think of it, it's elastic. That tree could begin 1 million years ago or 100 million years ago. You just don't know, unless you can insert some fossils to put a limit on the depth of the tree. And of course, if you don't know the depth of the tree, you can't talk about rate of evolution or anything like that. And the other point, which was pointed out recently, which again is quite obvious, is if you are only projecting the living species back in time, once you go back 1 million years or more, the amount of uncertainty is huge because you have trimmed out all the fossil species. And the second thing about morphology, of course, is evolution acts on morphology. Evolution does not act directly on the molecules. And so natural selection, which is the fundamental principle of evolution, is all about the external morphology and species that survive, those that go extinct, all that, the stuff about fitness, et cetera, it's all about size and strength and diet and ecology and blah, blah, blah. And of course, the machine, the motor of all of this is the molecules, but that's just the motor. And therefore, I think it's also been realized if we want to understand evolution in terms of how it works and why it matters, we have to focus on morphology. And therefore, using the computational tools we have, the other criticism that used to be there, which was we can't use all of our fancy computational methods on fossils, we can now say, oh yes, you can. And therefore, there's a fundamental argument, which is that natural selection acts on morphology, but there's also now a practical argument, which is to say, you can now include fossils, because that when I started 30 years ago, you could not include fossils because all of the computational methods had been developed purely for the use of molecular studies. So we have a fundamental argument and we have a practical argument, I would say.
What kind of data do you need for these computer applications that you need to apply for molecular or evolutionary studies? What kind of data should students be looking at generating?
Yes. 3 kinds of data. So first of all, you need a very good quality timescale so that you can locate your fossils against that timescale. Secondly, you need some confidence in understanding the morphology and biology of the organisms you're interested in. And so whatever the group happens to be, you need to know something about the biology of modern relatives to understand how you can interpret the skeleton, whether it's a shell or like a human skeleton or whatever. And thirdly, you generally need some kind of phylogenetic tree. So some kind of understanding of relationships between the species. You've got to be able to discriminate the species, of course, and then draw some kind of a tree. And you can draw the tree in any way you like. It doesn't have to be done in a strictly computational way. For some fossil groups, it's often easier to do it in a more stratigraphic way. So the 3 things you need: timescale, phylogeny, and some knowledge of the traits and biology.
Okay. Last 2-3 questions. One question is, can endemic or indigenous fauna put so much pressure that cosmopolitan or exotic species can go extinct?
That's very interesting. Yes. So the question is whether endemic faunas can cause cosmopolitan species to go extinct. I don't know the answer to that. I would think normally that would not happen, because one of the principles of ecology, well, we know from Darwin that competition is important. The competition is the ecological driver of change. So 2 species or individuals somehow compete with each other. But one of the consequences of competition is called character displacement. And that is, if 2 species, maybe a small one and a large one, are competing for food, normally they, in a way, come to an agreement. It's not normal that species A kills species B completely. So the smaller one will start eating smaller examples of the food, and the bigger one will start eating bigger. So there's a sort of displacement to kind of avoid competition. So I think in those cases, the species would interact and they would adapt to each other. And so probably not cause the extinction of each other.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. Another question is there any trend to extinction, or is it just a historical contingency? How much data can be extracted from fossil phylogeny?
Yes. So I think extinction is a contingency in the point that it just happens when it happens. There's nothing really predictable about it. We may be able to derive figures for extinction rate, whether they're natural or unnatural extinction rates. But those rates are based on a kind of stochastic understanding that you have a population of 100 species, and we know within a certain amount of time, one of those species probably will go extinct, but we couldn't actually say exactly which one. So it's contingent, but it has that predictable property because it's a sort of stochastic process, I suppose, in some ways a bit like radioactive decay. We know there is a rate of decay, but we don't know which atom is going to decay next. I'm trying to think now, I can't remember the second part of the question, contingency. And then I suppose the particular bigger events, of course, they look more deterministic in the sense that suddenly there's a whole lot of extinction at the same time. That then depends on a question of how predictable you think volcanic events are and other crises on the Earth. And people would probably say, most people would probably say the chances of a huge volcanic eruption or the impact of a meteorite happening on my house today is unpredictable. We don't know. It's probably quite a small probability, but it's not impossible. And so probably at every level, we'd have to say these are contingent events, really.
Yeah, but the second part of the question was, how much data can we extract from fossil phylogeny, and how far can we go to do that?
Yes, so I think that's very important, and that's a topic we've discussed briefly already. And I think the amount that we can extract, the amount of information and the amount of confidence is much higher now than it was 10 years ago. And I think a good answer to that is that there is a lot of uncertainty, of course, about the fossil record. There's uncertainty about the dating of the rocks. There's uncertainty about our phylogenetic trees. There's uncertainty about our paleobiological inferences about the diet or the mode of life. But of course, if you apply a statistical approach, you take care of that because you model the uncertainty. And the simplest example is, of course, the confidence interval on a radiometric date. That is a measure of uncertainty. And in many of the other statistical methods that we use, we are modeling uncertainty all the time. Therefore, like any other natural science, we are doing the same thing. We don't have to be apologetic. We just say, we are natural scientists, like people who study ecology or climate or anything else, and we can model the uncertainty. And therefore, if you do that, and some people will be familiar with Bayesian statistical methods, and Bayesian methods allow you to model all kinds of uncertainty, and you can you iterate your calculations sometimes millions of times. And if you rerun the calculation millions and millions of times with every possible uncertainty modeled, and you still get the same answer, then you have a certain amount of confidence. So I think I would say the answer to that is largely we take care of it by adopting normal statistical procedures. And I expect that Prasanta Mahalanobis would agree with that.
Okay, last two questions. What kind of physical evolution do we expect Homo sapiens to undergo? Next.
Okay. I think everybody has got a great idea about that. And my idea is probably no better than anybody else. People sometimes say that because we are civilized, we live in certain ways, we look after sick people, we try to be kind to each other, that in some way we have escaped from or gone away from evolution. And I'm sure there must be some truth in that. Because in a pure Darwinian world, I guess you have to leave sick people behind and they die and all that kind of stuff. Yes, and then another prediction is to say, well, we all sit at computers all day, so we will lose the use of our legs and we will just end up looking like a light bulb with a very big head and maybe some fingers for typing, but no legs. I have got no idea.
Okay, one quick question. There are 2, 3. Anyways, you spoke about macroevolution. Can you give us a few examples of macroevolution to make it more clear?
Okay, I guess a mass extinction event is one example of a macroevolutionary event. You could say diversifications are another example. For example, the explosive diversification of beetles or birds or any group. You could say they acquire some character. Birds, for example, evolve to be able to fly, and then suddenly they get very diverse. So that's a macroevolutionary pattern and process. I think you could also say a third example would be the changing faunas that we see through the Cenozoic, because during the Cenozoic, temperatures have generally declined. There's been kind of irregularity, but generally over the last 66 million years, temperatures worldwide have gone down quite slowly. And in response to that, we get the spread of grasslands happening at a particular time, and then that has a big effect. You could take that example, the spread of prairies, the spread of grasslands. in the Oligocene and Miocene, that led to big ecological changes in the kinds of mammal faunas, and you then get animals living out on the open grassland instead of camouflaged in the forests. And I think all of those kinds of things are the material of macroevolution. They're kind of biological processes that we can investigate.
Do we have any evidences of newly evolving species?
I'm sure there are examples. I think the easiest examples come from plants. There are lots of cases where new species of plants have emerged in the last 100 years, sometimes by human intervention, by hybridizing two existing species and making a third species. I think there are some cases of birds and mammals on small islands where people have seen in the last 100 years substantial change. I can't remember any really good examples though. Okay.
One last question with which we'll end it for today, because I have a lot of questions for you. Why is it that the reptiles or the dinosaurs are linked to the birds in evolution? What are the evidences that link them to the birds?
I think we've known this from the days of Darwin, really. And 2 years after the publication of Origin of Species, 1859, in 1861, the first specimen of Archaeopteryx was found in Germany, the Archaeopteryx ancient bird. And it's been regarded as a so-called missing link ever since. And I think it was correctly interpreted. So Thomas Henry Huxley, who was a friend of Darwin's, he studied these and he said, looking at the fossil, you can see that this is like a dinosaur in bird's clothing. And so every aspect of the skeleton was a little flesh-eating dinosaur. But the fact was he was covered in feathers. And so was a bird, and the feathers were complex and were like proper flight feathers on the wings of a pigeon or whatever. So we've actually known that and for a long time. And then all the new discoveries from South America, Europe, China in particular, have really confirmed that. And what we now know is in the middle and late Jurassic, there were about 4 or 5 lines of little flesh-eating dinosaurs that were getting smaller. So mostly dinosaurs just get big and bigger, but these were going against the normal pattern of evolution. They were getting smaller, and it seems they were adapted to climbing in trees, and probably they were evolving that way because they were focusing on a diet of insects, and of course in the trees were this untapped diet. There were not many lizards, there were not many mammals, and so there was nothing much eating these insects. And there were about 4 or 5 groups of dinosaurs experimenting with flight. And by flight, I just mean like gliding, just using the wings, but not really flapping. And then one group evolved the ability, the muscles to flap the wings, and those are the birds, and then they became the dominant group. So what we now know is that there's a whole array. And then the other point is that feathers go all the way back to the origin of dinosaurs. So we now know from amazing quality fossils in different parts of the world that many, many dinosaurs, not just those that were very close to the origin of birds, but many, many dinosaurs had feathers of some kind, even if they're just simple whiskers of some sort. And so that goes back to the origin of dinosaurs in the Triassic. So if most of them had feathers, and the bone shows that most dinosaurs were warm-blooded, and then one group evolves into the birds. So birds are dinosaurs. There's no question.
Okay. With this, I think, yes, one last question. A lot of people, the Permo-Triassic boundary, why does man still know very less about this boundary event, this extinction event? Why is there so less known about it? And still more and more people want to do more about it.
That's right. I think that there's a huge amount. So I think the amount known by the public is not very much. Because, of course, a lot of popular books are simply written about dinosaurs, of course, and everybody cares about the end Cretaceous mass extinction 66 million years ago. And I guess as geologists, we know that because the end Cretaceous mass extinction is closer to the present day, the quality of knowledge is better because we can get better dating and there's more localities we can study, etc., etc. But I must say that the scientific knowledge of the end Permian mass extinction is huge. So I think when I started my interest 20 years ago, there were maybe only 5 or 6 papers each year around the world. And then suddenly now there must be about 2,000 or 3,000 papers each year coming out of China, India, Europe, North America. So there's a huge amount of work going on at the moment.
Okay. I think with this, yes, finally, yes, I'm going to say thank you so much for being so patient with us. And we had an equal number of people on YouTube watching us. And your talk is going to go online because I'm going to put up this recording in public and send you a link.
Great.
I give my formal vote of thanks to Professor Michael Benton. He's been really kind, and there were a few issues when I sent him a mail and he wouldn't find it and answered back after a few days, and I answered. So that itself extended this talk for I think over 2 weeks. But I'm really, really grateful to you, Professor Benton, for accepting our invitation and helping us start this. You have made a grand opening to this lecture series of the Paleontological Society of India. And I'm very, very thankful to our Vice Chancellor, Professor Nitin Karmalkar. I'm very grateful to all the audience who joined us in here today. And the city that I am in is in a state of curfew. And a lot of people from all across the country have connected. And we are really grateful to you for accepting our invitation and delivering this very lucid talk. And I think you gave equal amount of time to answer to our questions. Thank you so much, sir, for accepting our invitation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. That's very kind.
Yes, thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Yes, bye-bye, bye-bye, bye-bye. Yes. We will keep you all posted about the next lecture series. I think we should be able to get you 1 lecture every week. And I'm posting my phone number here publicly to everyone. So anyone who wants to be connected to my WhatsApp group is free to use this phone number and connect. I will add you on to the broadcasting WhatsApp group where we will keep publicizing the different talks. We intend to cover macro and micro paleontology with a focus on looking at the applied aspects of paleontology, which are continuously improvising upon every day. Thank you, everyone, for connecting with us and joining us for this talk here. Without you, this event wouldn't have been successful. Thank you so much. More recording set.